As Christians, it's imperative that we are armed with the proper answers to tough questions that the world comes to us with in regards to our faith in the Bible and why we believe what we believe in the Gospels. And what better way to do this than digging into the actual evidence? And I have a special one lined up for you guys today. So I handpicked, and I'm super excited about this, I handpicked 7 of Wes Huff's most memorable or I think, logical answers to some of the hardest questions out there as far as theology is concerned, or Christian theology in general. So, Wes, if you're unfamiliar, is a brilliant Christian apologist, meaning he teaches people to understand why they believe what they believe and provides evidence of why we believe in the Gospels, why we believe in the core truths of Christianity. So, he's pretty much out there on the front lines for us Christians. So, he's an awesome dude. Super intelligent, and has a way of putting things that might be super complicated normally into words you can kind of understand, I should say. But awesome guy, really likable. So he's been making his rounds lately. I guess you could consider him famous now. I mean, he's super blown up over the last year. He's been on the Joe Rogan podcast, the Flagrant podcast. So he's just been making his rounds. So we appreciate Wes as fellow Christians, of course. So he's been out there doing the Lord's work. So super pumped to show you what he has up his sleeve. But if you are serious about strengthening your faith, then these 7 handpicked answers that he's given, I really think will kick you off in the right direction as far as Christian apologetics is concerned and defending your faith. Okay. So I did save the best for last. So make sure to stick around till the 7th. So we've only got 7 to get through. And like I said, I think you guys will get a lot out of this. So, all right. But before we jump into it, please go ahead and like this so that the algorithm pushes it out. And if you're not currently subscribed to my channel, but you like content like this or Christian content in general, please go ahead and hit subscribe. All right, let's get into it. Okay. So for this first clip, I'm going to start you out kind of basic if we can. These are kind of some of the classic atheistic arguments to kind of warm you up. These are common arguments that I hear all the time. And it's actually, when I was a skeptic, I actually had a lot of these same questions. So we'll go ahead and start here. So the first one we're going to go over is why are God and not the 3,000 other gods that other religions, worship? And he was actually on Piers Morgan talking about this. So let's go ahead and give it a shot here.
He's one of the world's most famous atheists. And he says, look, there are 3,000 gods if you add them all up from all the religions. Who's to say your one's the real one? And what about the others then? Do they not exist? Are they not real gods? In other words, his position is, look, you can't all be right.
Yeah, well, I think it's a rather foolish argument in that competition doesn't negate objective reality. So say we're using a courtroom analogy. If someone was convicted of a crime here in the city of Toronto, where I live, and he stood before a judge and he said, really, you think I committed this crime? Do you know how many people are in the city? We have 3 million people in this city. And you think I'm the one who did the crime? Really? Out of all the, how many people are in Toronto? How many people are in Ontario? How many people are in Canada? How many people are in North America? You really think that given the amount of people that are on this earth, I'm the one who committed the crime? We wouldn't then look at the judge and say, well, that's a good argument. Have you really thought about how many other people are around who, just because this particular individual you think committed the crime? Really? Well, no, we don't just arbitrarily, pick someone, or in the case of Christianity, pick a God. We believe that the God of the Bible is the true God based on the evidence of not just what we find in the Bible, but the fine-tuning of the universe, of the morality in the objective reality of this world, and the fact that we are, Pierce, people who operate with morals, with meaning and intention, and have intrinsic worth. But we look at these things and we don't arbitrarily pick Yahweh, the God of the Bible, over Zeus and Thor and Allah and Buddha. We do it, I would argue, based on the concrete, publicly available evidence that points to the truth claims that I would argue Christianity answers in regards to the ultimate questions we have.
Right. So we're not just blindly following. There's educated opinion behind why we trust in God. And I'm sure a lot of you can agree that feeling the presence of God is really what makes him so real. And yeah, so it's not like we're just picking one, willy nilly, like, oh, I could just choose this one today. Like, we specifically believe in Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay, so for number 2, we're going to take a look at Pierce saying that eyewitness accounts are not credible. And because, a lot of the Gospels and things like that were, ultimately we rely on a lot of the eyewitnesses that were with Jesus, especially the disciples. So he's claiming that this is not an accurate, this wouldn't stand up in court, basically, or this is not an accurate, way of getting to the bottom of these things and a way of proof. So Wes has the perfect answer, of course. So check this out.
Now, again, to play devil's advocate, the argument against it goes, look, all these witnesses were likely to have been pretty primitive, mostly illiterate people. Eyewitness testimony notoriously is unreliable. It's the least credible evidence in a courtroom these days, for example.
Well, all of ancient history, in one sense, is hearsay, but that doesn't apply when we apply it to the historiographical method. We need to use the same standards that when we would look at something like, say, the biographies of Tiberius with Velleius Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassiodeo. When we have multiple instances of reporting on someone's life, we look at both the things that they agree on and the things maybe where they have a differentiation in detail, and then we try to the best of our ability explain some of the different instances that are going on. Now, I would say, to the accusation, well, these are just ancient, illiterate people. That's what C.S. Lewis referred to as chronological snobbery. Just because people are ancient neither means they're stupid nor that they don't know what's going on. And what we have in terms of this event is really early on after Jesus's death, we have an explanation of what if the resurrection didn't take place, what we would expect. The 11 disciples are hiding in the upper room. They're scared. They're aware of other messianic movements in the ancient world. Individuals like Simon Bar Giora, who claimed to be the Messiah when his movement was squashed. So when he died, his movement was squashed. And so I think we have to look at, okay, what explains these 11 scared disciples then going on to not just proclaim that Jesus did rise from the dead, but actually went to the point of risking their lives in persecution. And some of them did die for that proclamation. And so I think it's not outside of the realm of possibility for history to actually be able to evaluate this evidence and say, okay, we have these questions. How then do we explain something like an empty tomb, or even Jesus's disciples go back and the account of the Pentecost happens in Jerusalem. So Jesus's disciples go back to the scene of the crime in the town where people would have saw him crucified, and now they're proclaiming he's resurrected. Well, why would you go back to the place where people could have actually known what actually happened, especially if you're trying to be disingenuous or dishonest? And then that's where it happens. And Stephen is the first martyr. That also happens in Jerusalem. That would have been a warning shot across the bow for the disciples if they wanted to continue on proclaiming these things. They would have realized that this is controversial, both in Jewish circles and in Gentile circles, to be proclaiming these things, to be declaring Jesus as Lord. One of the earliest confessions of Christianity was Jesus is Lord, when the society was saying Caesar is Lord. And so there were risks politically, there were risks religiously, and yet the disciples go on to proclaim these things, even to the detriment of their own lives.
Yeah, and we'll go into a little bit more near the end. It's actually one of the ones I saved for the best for last, but in regards to the reliability of the actual eyewitness accounts and the Gospels themselves. So, but great answer, of course. Number 3. So this is kind of a new age lie that's been going on, and I hear it more and more, that Jesus was made up from other religions and there was pagan influence in the Bible. So, a lot of the Gnostic Gospels, things like that, which are like, false Gospels, basically, the enemy trying to pollute the real gospel and taint it. Of course, we know that as Christians, but you know, was Jesus actually legit, or was he just some made up, basically mythical character that was kind of like combined from all these different religions? Now this was a clip from the Flagrant podcast that Wes was just on a few weeks ago. So this one is super interesting.
What about the accusations that like even the Jesus story was taken from other myths in other religions? I think like the Egyptian god Ra or something like that. Like what do you say about this? Is it just like a common occurrence? Like how do you feel? Is it bullshit?
Yes.
Really?
Well,
Talk
so
that shit.
it's Jesus mythicism, and no historian, like even the people who doubt that Jesus exists, don't use that argument, because usually historians are aware of the primary sources. And if you look at the stories of like Horus, Ra, Mithras, Attis, if you look at the details and then try to find the parallels, they're just not there. It was made up by largely and popularized by the
Dan Brown?
Zeitgeist.
Oh.
You know, the movie Zeitgeist?
Yeah.
It's like a YouTube thing.
Yeah.
It's made up from thin air. So if you look at the actual stories of like Horus, Ra, the accusations of virgin births and 12 disciples, and you won't find them in those things. You won't.
Really? And isn't there connectivity to some Indian?
I think the story of baby Krishna, I think there's some connectivity in that. I think he was the king tried to kill him, like couldn't do it.
So it's not that there aren't parallels that you can make. It's that like if you look at the actual core of the details. So there's a fallacy called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, where it's this idea that Texan is shooting in the side of a barn, and he then finds the closest cluster of shots and he paints a target around it, making himself look like a great shot, right? So if you want to find parallels, you can find them,
and then you make the accusation afterwards.
Yeah. So
that makes sense.
Let me see if I can give you an example. So John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln were both, the presidencies were exactly 100 years apart. And Abraham Lincoln had an assistant by the name of Kennedy, and Kennedy had an assistant by the name of Lincoln. Both were assassinated by a man who went by three names, right? John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald. Kennedy was assassinated in a Lincoln. And Lincoln was assassinated in the Ford Theater. So, like, if you want to go down the rabbit trail of trying to find all these things, you could argue that John F. Kennedy never existed. He was just a copy of Lincoln.
Yeah, so you can kind of create parallels, of course, after the fact in hindsight, wherever you want down the road. But one thing that I found super interesting about this one is that I, previous to finding Jesus, was super deceived by the New Age beliefs. And something that I kept hearing in those circles was like Christ consciousness. And this is just another one of the lies that, you know, Christ is in every religion somehow. And if you look at the top religions, you look at, you know, obviously Judaism, Islam, Christianity, obviously. But if you look at the world's top religion, Hindu, which is what one of the guys on the podcast actually grew up Hindu, or in a family that practiced that. And there's always a Jesus figure. So everyone agrees, at least the world's largest religions agree, that Jesus was real and was a man. He's looked to with reverence, but they just question the divinity of Jesus. So one thing when I was searching God and I was actually trying to figure all this stuff out because I didn't know what to believe, when I was on my search for truth, when I found that out, that helped put the nail in the coffin. So it's like, okay, if all these other religions are talking about Jesus Christ, but the only religion that Jesus Christ is actually from and is actually originates from is Christianity, then clearly these are the ripoffs, you know? So that kind of was like common sense to me, I guess. That when you take a religious figure from, you know, basically just copy paste him and just change a few things in religions that were made much later, especially, for example, Islam, created, I think it was like 600 years later, then that kind of tells you something about where the source of truth is. So yeah, that's just kind of like a ridiculous one to me. That doesn't even track. So the fourth one we have is confirmation bias. So Julian, he was actually on I can't remember his last name, but Julian's podcast, who is a big entrepreneur and went full-time podcaster basically, and he's got a huge following as well. But he was asking Wes about his confirmation bias, and does he feel like that gets in the way of him doing his historical research and these scholarly studies of his.
I always ask them if their belief system, because that is a belief system too, ever they feel like it drives the results.
And Wes correcting some of Julian's misconceptions. Here's Julian asking Wes about being biased.
I always ask them if their belief system, because that is a belief system too, ever they feel like it drives the results they end up getting, like a confirmation bias, if you will. Do you ever think about that with respect to your faith? Because that's obviously something very personal to you as well.
Yeah, I mean, we all have biases.
Yes.
I mean, find me the person who's neutral and you're not dealing with a real individual, right?
Possible.
So I'm totally fine with the biases that I hold. I mean, my field in biblical studies, there are a lot of secular scholars, and they also come in with a bias. And so it's not that it's like religious scholars versus secular scholars. I mean, we agree on a whole host of things. But often it's not the evidence and the rationale that we're disagreeing on. It's the conclusions that we then draw from it.
Right.
So basically, confirmation bias is just kind of like a non-issue here because everyone has bias, and that's an open fact, But like he said, the conclusion of what the evidence is, because science will show you exactly what historically, they're researching will confirm things. And then the conclusion is where they differ in opinion, and that's where their personal biases come in. So because everyone equally has bias, and it's a recognized thing, especially in the scholarly community, that's not even a problem, if you will. So pretty easy one, actually. All right, so let's get into the good stuff. So these last three are about the historical accuracy of the Bible, which is the most historically accurate book to ever exist. And we're going to start with, why are there biblical discrepancies between the four Gospels? So if you've ever read them right in a row, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you see that there are these tiny discrepancies in the storylines. So he's going to answer that for the Flagrant podcast here.
Sorry to interrupt here. So is each one of the apostles teaching their version of Jesus's life? And do those differ slightly? And is Christianity kind of like fracturing a little bit in those first few hundred years?
So yes and no. So this goes to your question in terms of the differentiation in detail. So the fact is we have four biographies, and sometimes they tell the same stories, but they give different angles on the stories. So we have a similar thing with the emperor at the time, Tiberius.
Yeah.
So the only other person who's sort of comparative to Jesus in terms of source information is the emperor. So you have Jesus, and then you have the most powerful, the most well-known, the richest person at the time. And he also has four biographies of himself, or at least four. Don't kick that, please.
Thank you.
Sorry. Not while I'm talking.
Forgive
Andrew.
me. Forgive me.
Tiberius has Velius Paterculus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus, who are all writing source information for him. So if we can do like a comparative analysis for someone with Jesus, the emperor is a good guy to do it because he likewise has four individuals who are writing about his life.
You're saying as an example of their importance and impact?
Or like, how can we look at source information? Now, the Gospels are a little bit different because they're pretty comprehensive and they're only about Jesus, whereas these other guys are writing, say, about emperors more broadly. And so there's like snippets here and there. But what I was getting at is we have differences in those stories too. Or like Socrates.
I get what you're saying.
Socrates has three biographers.
Yeah, it's three different sports writers writing about the game. They might have different angles, but at the end of the day, this is the score, and these are how much these people played, and they're going to reference who the superstars were.
Yeah, and the detail. So I would say a differentiation in detail doesn't necessarily amount to a contradiction.
Yeah, I mean, basically, if anything, I mean, just like you've probably heard them like detective shows, where the cops will split up two people that were somewhere when something went down, and if their stories are exactly the same, then they're obviously planned, right? So they premeditatedly made up this story together, whereas these gospels are written independently from each other, and they're going to have different little, nuances here and there from different people's point of view. So that's why there's small discrepancies in between the four gospels, because it's four different people writing four different viewpoints. So there's nothing that would be a salvation issue that is argued upon or that is different. So these are minor details, of course. So, all right. So these next two, man, we've got these are the good ones. So we've got the Council of Nicea, which is a huge myth that's been totally blown out of proportion, mainly because of the book and movie, The Da Vinci Code, which completely, I guess, polluted the actual idea of what the Council of Nicea was. So I always understood it this way too, growing up, and it confused me until actually recently hearing Wes talk about it. And I still have friends that this is the reason they don't believe in the Bible, because they believe in this myth of the Council of Nicea. The going myth is that there was this council, basically, I think it was 325 AD, I want to say, and that Constantine was there, and all the bishops, and basically the big wigs, and the politicians and the church, so the political church, basically, and they decided what books stayed and what books went, as far as the Bible is concerned, which is debunked here with Wes. So, and you can see on the way that Julian's talking that yeah, I mean, if this was true, this would be of huge concern. So let's just watch Wes dismantle this real quick.
You have this Council of Nicea in the 4th century.
Mm-hmm.
It was like
325.
Yeah, 325. So this is where my brain wires get like blocked a little bit, because you have a power structure, the Roman government led by the emperor, who now sees this new growing idea where there's many Christians within his empire, and he's going, oh, we're having trouble putting a button on this. Like, they really believe in this guy Jesus Christ and what happened, and by the way, we kind of put him to death. That's not a good look. So they have this big meeting with a lot of different people, and they dictate, guess what? We are now the Holy Roman Empire. We believe in Christianity, and here's everything that happened. And the question is, you have power-hungry men in this meeting,
Sure,
who are now dictating, taking legitimate pieces of history, but deciding what we're going to tell the public about, or what we're going to make the book. And the reason I bring this up is because within this meeting and subsequent, practicing of the religion throughout the empire afterwards, there was a decision made where these are the four gospels we use, not these other gospels that we found as well. And one of the alleged gospels there, but all of them are interesting, is that, like Mary Magdalene had a gospel, and she's not written about in great terms, or at least in implied great terms, in the four gospels they chose, as opposed to in her gospel and another gospel's written. It's like, yo, she wasn't like she was Jesus's companion, perhaps his wife, and then it gets into like, oh, does Jesus have a kid or something like that? That's kind of a step farther. But like, what do you make of the fact that the religion, which you are not a part of the Catholic Church, right? You're a part of Protestant, but all
part of my heritage.
Exactly. Yeah. All Christianity branched off from that. That's where we'll get to Martin Luther later. I wanted to put a pin in that. But like, what do you think of the fact that like there are political power structures that took this history and decided what people are going to see, and then basically said, this is why we believe that way? Because they also at this meeting allegedly decided we're going to make Jesus divine, even though I agree with you. I think that there's historical evidence before that points to people saying, oh yeah, no, he is divine. He did rise from the dead.
So some corrective history there. Let me just say right off the bat, the Council of Nicea, the reason it was called was to deal with an issue called Arianism. So there was a guy named Arius who was a minister in North Africa, and he believed that Jesus was God, but he believed that Jesus was created by the Father and the Godhead. So this is the topic of the Council of Nicea.
So Arianism basically would discredit Jesus' divinity, that he is the Son of God, which is considered heresy because that's a core foundation of the gospel. So that's what this whole meeting was about, to, discuss the divinity of Jesus and just to stick up for the belief that was already in place, or to reinforce it.
The topic of the Council of Nicea actually had nothing to do with the books of the Bible. So the books of the Bible had already been established centuries before.
Not for the Roman Empire, though.
Which is the huge misconception that that they were just cherry picking, these political figureheads were just cherry picking books of the Bible so that people could only see certain things, basically. That would be a huge problem, but that's absolutely not true. So the Da Vinci Code did a work on people's psychology behind this.
For the Roman Empire, though.
What do you mean?
Meaning this is where the Roman Empire officially kind of makes their shift to like, yay, we're Christians now, right? Like that's...
So it isn't.
It isn't.
No. So Constantine converts to Christianity, but he doesn't make Christianity the imperial religion of Rome. That's
right, not lawfully. Right.
Yeah, so that's under Theodosius, which is after him. The Council of Nicea doesn't even talk about the books of Scripture. So nothing at the Council of Nicea has anything to do with the canon of Scripture. That's already an established fact.
I know. That's what I'm saying. So how would the Roman Empire have gotten along with the acceptance of what the Gospels are?
Oh, they don't. No, this is established by Christianity.
Yes,
So Christians,
I know that.
So Christians already have the 27 books that we call the New Testament.
So yeah, the books of the Bible were already established by the Christian community. And this leads us into our last one, which is the Apostolic Fathers. So the disciples of Jesus, the ones that spent time with him and were entrusted with the truth of the gospel, had disciples of their own. And those were the Apostolic Fathers, and some of them being the first church fathers of the first century. And that's where a lot of these books were preserved and came from. So, and obviously guarded with their lives. So that's our next one, and our very last, number 7. The canon, meaning the actual books of the Bible, and why we can believe that the canon is correct. That we have filtered out all the false gospel that the enemy tried to pollute and that society tried to inject into the actual word of God. But we have an all-powerful God, so he will preserve his word, that's for sure. And the apostolic disciples. So let's go ahead and look into that real quick. So here's where this is why you can know that what you are reading is actually accurate. Okay.
And who would you say established that? Like, it may not be one person, but like what people said, yo, this is what we're going with.
So there are lots of canon lists within the early church. So even though we kind of have this idea that somebody somewhere got together and voted on books.
That's what I used to think. So I'm like, well, if it's a God-inspired word, then, man is fallible. So if man put it together, but he goes in to explain that these were literally the disciples or people that were disciples of the disciples that were in charge of this.
And realistically, that never actually took place in history. It was a lot slower and a lot more organic than that. And there were disagreements on some books and not others. So very, very early on, you have the Gospels. Nobody disagrees on the Gospels. And
nobody disagrees on that.
No, everybody agrees that these are the 4 books.
What? Everybody?
Well, all the Christians. So here's the thing. The disciples of Jesus had disciples. And those are individuals who we call the Apostolic Fathers.
Yeah.
Because they have a direct association
with... It's like a bloodline almost.
Yeah. It's like the paper trail that goes back to the chain of custody that goes back to Jesus.
Good way to put it.
And part of this is that we have individuals who know Mark, and we have individuals who know Mark who say, hey, this Mark guy is not a disciple, but he's a traveling companion of Peter. And he follows Peter around and he writes what Peter says. And so we have a number of individuals like this, Irenaeus, Polycarp, Papias. And so they give us this unanimous confirmation within this early community, because it's not a very big community at this point, in saying, okay, well, we know who the authors of the Gospels are, and we have this direct chain of custody paper trail that goes back to the earliest Jesus community. So for example, the last line of the Gospel of Thomas, has Peter looking at Jesus and saying, hey, Mary's here. Get Mary out because women are not worthy of life. And so Jesus says, don't worry. I'm going to make her into a male that resembles you, male. And the last line of the Gospel of Thomas is, every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven.
Like transgenderism?
So it's complicated, right? They were before their time, right? So the early church looked at this kind of content and they went, what is this?
Yeah.
Like, that's not, we know what the teaching of Jesus sounds like. It ain't that. And one thing that's very unique about some of these documents is there's a criteria within historiography that's referred to as the criterion of embarrassment. And so the idea is, if there is something within the writing that reflects very poorly on either the authors or the people connected with the authors, it is a good assumption to say that it is probably true. Not that it's always true, but that's probably true, because you're not going to put your, right, this is what I was, we were talking earlier about some of the perspectives of prophethood in Islam versus Christianity. My Muslim friends have a problem with the prophets looking as bad as they do in the Old Testament, because they're like, a representation of a man of God wouldn't look like that.
And they.
So, for example, he goes into like the example of King David, who, you know, was an amazing king and, you know, did all these great things for God's kingdom, but also had an affinity for women and had like all these weaknesses too. And that's a reoccurring theme throughout the Bible, is that God uses broken people. Paul, you know, who used to kill Christians, literally persecute and kill Christians. You know, and that just shows the transformative power of accepting Jesus, that he can literally heal any heart. And just like he says in the book of Ezekiel, that he will take your heart of stone and make it a heart of flesh. So, and that's the cool thing about our God, is that everyone can be redeemed, and Jesus is a chain breaker. So that's why, you know, you see so many people that are able to just let go of addictions and let go of certain sin that you would never be able to let go of, because Jesus gives us that power and that authority. So the key is obviously throwing yourself in his arms and not some of these false gospels and these false gods. But the last thing that I'll say and touch on is that, yeah, in case you missed that, basically there's easy ways to identify some of the false gospels that were trying to be pushed in, you know, like the Gospel of Thomas and all of that. They have very pagan beliefs that are completely counter intuitive and completely contradictory to Jesus' actual ministry. So, you know, like the thing that he just mentioned about women, for example, Jesus would never say that or do that. That was not Jesus' teachings. And the people that were with him, his apostles, were able to verify that because they were literally with him. So if you look at these historical context, if you look at this historically, the Gospels are actually, I would argue, the most historically accurate books that we have ever existed, because most written history is at some point either written down hundreds of years later, or, you know, like Alexander the Great. That's one that was written down, you know, 300 years later or so, and people have no problem believing that. But of course, when you talk about Jesus, it's like, okay, well, you know, this could have all been hearsay, et cetera, et cetera. But ironically, Jesus is actually agreed upon secular scholars and everyone that obviously Jesus existed and was crucified. That's a fact. Okay. So actually has some of the most credible sources out of a lot of the history that you probably read in your history books or did, you know, growing up. So moral of the story, we can count on and have faith in the Bible. And if you ever find yourself doubting or having questions, just ask God to reveal himself to you. Open up his word, ask him to reveal himself, and he will. So that's the cool thing about our God, is that we have a one-on-one communication line to him at all times. So through prayer, worship, reading his word. So it's cool. Having a relationship with God is something that I hope that everyone can experience someday. So, and that's why I do this. That's why I share the gospel this way. So, all right, that's going to about do it for me, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. As always, Jesus loves you, and have a good night.